Hello, everybody. And today we're going to be focusing on the movement of peoples in the 19th century. And this will be the last topic for Unit 6. And Unit 6, when we look at it, we're talking about the effects of industrialization. So I've called this unit imperialism, but what the AP curriculum calls it is the effects of industrialization. Imperialism is one big effect, but this migration of peoples in the 19th century is the other big effect. So, as we take a look at this topic, we want to start first with kind of a generalization, general movements of people that you should be familiar with during the 19th century. When I say the 19th century, I'm talking over the whole scope of it. So, when we talk about Indians through migration, people immigrating out of India, the Indians who immigrate or migrate throughout the globe are going to largely stay within the British Empire. And this is going to be a very common thing with migration, is that peoples who are migrating are going to migrate throughout the empire. So in the case of Indians, we're going to see Indians going into British colonies in the Caribbeans or British possessions in the Caribbeans. The British colony of South Africa, British colonies in East Africa, and into Fiji Islands. The Chinese, we're going to see a Chinese migration into California, as well as into the British Malaya, or what we call Malaysia. The Japanese are going to go to Hawaii, Peru, Cuba. And Africans, I put this in to make sure you understand that in the early 19th century, the trading of enslaved Africans is still continuing. Abolition really doesn't get going till 1808 and thereafter. So we do have a migration of people coming to the Caribbean and South America, such as Brazil, Haiti, that region of the world in the early part of the 19th century. So, and if you notice, I have that as letter F. That's because I was editing my PowerPoint. That should really say letter D. I had changed some things. The map on the right side of this slide goes into a little bit more detail. And my suggestion to you is not to obsess terribly much. The big thing to notice is that there's Asian populations, Japanese, Chinese, and Indian populations who are migrating to Hawaii, South America, and the Caribbean. You see Europeans immigrating to the United States, to South America, to South Africa. You see that South Africa is a place where a lot of immigrants are coming in. And you want to have a general idea. I wouldn't obsess over this, knowing every one of them in detail. But at the same time, if you would like to, just pause it and study the map in minute detail. So, the next thing we want to talk about is the forms of labor that are going on that's making this migration possible. So, I haven't quite caught into the why is this happening. What right now I'm doing is just setting up what is happening. So, the 19th century is a remarkable century because abolition is starting to take effect and is starting to have an impact on the international slave trade. While there will still be a slave trade in Africa, within Africa, the transportation of enslaved peoples from Africa to the Americas is going to start to cease in the early part of the 19th century. However, that's going to lead a gap, if you will, in labor demands. So we're going to see some movement of people. Some of this movement is going to be voluntary. These are migrants who decide to pick up and go to another country. For example, Italians are going to voluntarily go to Argentina. Not all Italians, of course, but some Italians are going to end up going to Argentina to work in factory jobs within Argentina. There are going to be Japanese citizens who voluntarily go to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations within Hawaii. In the case of China, there's going to be Chinese workers who come over to the western part of the United States and provide labor as part of the building of the railroads and the transcontinental railroads, but also gold mining. In Ireland, you're going to see a migration of Irish into the United States, flooding throughout the eastern part of the United States and providing labor for the factories that are growing, as well as providing labor on farms. So we do see cases where people are voluntarily moving and they are moving to find jobs in other parts of the world. And sometimes they're leaving because it's in their best interest to leave behind the country they're in. Then, of course, we have forms of coerced labor and semi coerced labor. Coerced labor is forced upon the person, and slavery is one such example. And this, again, is in the very beginning of the 19th century. Really, that coerced form of labor, of slavery, is coming to an end throughout the 19th century in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and the trade that's going on between the America or across the Atlantic Ocean. And I realize now that was redundant, what I just said. But then we also have another form of coerced labor in the form of penal colonies. So, for example, prisoners who are given a choice whether or not to rot in jail or to go to a colony and try and make something. And the best example of that type of coerced labor would be the British sending prisoners to Australia. And then you have the semi coerced migration. So, in other words, these are people who aren't doing much better in terms of they're not working high wage jobs. In a lot of ways, they are kind of forced into an agreement that leads them to provide labor with very little compensation. We have contract labor that we're going to see in the case of Chinese laborers and Indian laborers coming to the Americas and Africa. And we're also going to see indentured servants. And this is an old system of coerced or semi-coerced labor. And in this case, we'll see I'm sorry, we should say Indians coming into Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Now, these type of semi-coerced migration, usually the labor they're providing is plantation labor and mining labor. So the labor they're providing is much more um, heavy in terms of demand, in terms of manual labor, and the wages are extremely low if there are wages. So when you look at the voluntary labor, this labor is going to end up in there's going to be higher wages involved in the voluntary labor as opposed to the semi coerced migrations. So the idea is that there's labor demands are kind of pushing this migration. And we have three different types of labor systems: voluntary, coerced, and semi coerced. You just want to appreciate how those three are tied into the migration patterns going on. Now, for the big thing, why is there this migration in the 19th century? So, if you think of it from a human history perspective, the movement of people across the globe is accelerating in the 19th century. And the reason that's able to happen is because of the changes in transportation technology. Steamboats and railroads are going to allow people to travel farther, much greater distances. So, for example, if you're a Russian serf who lives thousands of miles away from the coast, the railroad allows you the opportunity to get to the coast. The steamboat allows you the opportunity to travel across the Atlantic and end up in the Americas. So, this advance in technology is going to be critical to the increase of migration. The second thing is the changes to coerced labor practices. As I've referenced before, we have an abolition of slavery going on in the 19th century, but the sugar plantations still require workers. And that means that labor is going to be sought out. And that labor demand is going to be fulfilled through this immigrant labor coming into the Caribbean and into South America. It's going to fill that need for laborers on plantations and in mines, those being the two big ones. So the fact that slavery is coming to an end, at least throughout the Americas, it means that there's going to be a demand for workers to fill that demand. Third, imperialism makes a lot of this migration possible. As I mentioned at the top, Indian labor is going to migrate throughout the British Empire. So the British Empire is in South Africa, it's in Malaysia, it's in India, And you're going to see Indians traveling to South Africa and to Malaysia. They're traveling within the empire. So if you don't have that imperial connection, maybe this migration is a little bit more difficult to make happen. Letter D to me is the most important thing. The increased development of industrialism and cash cropping. Industrialism leads us to factories growing in New York City, factories growing throughout the United States, factories growing throughout South America, plantations that are engaged in cash cropping beyond just sugar, which is more 16th, 17th century, but new cash crops such as cotton, opium, tea. Those all require laborers. It requires unskilled, cheap labor. And that's where the immigrants are going to be supplying the labor that is in demand. Also, famines are going to act to push people out of their home countries. The greatest example of the famine would be the Irish potato famine of 1849 to 1852. So, the Irish potato famine is going to kill off about 500,000 people, but about 2 million people are going to leave Ireland in order to find work elsewhere because Ireland is just so dire and decimated by this famine. Ireland was not the only place where this happened. You remember in China, the Taiping Rebellion? The Taiping Rebellion was so destructive that a famine ensued. And for some Chinese immigrants, that's all the motivation they need to get out of China and find work somewhere else. Overpopulation is another issue. This is particularly true in Japan. The Japanese government, with its unification, centralization, modernization, started to realize they did not have the resources to support and sustain a large population. So the Japanese government was encouraging Japanese citizens to leave and seek work elsewhere. And in this case, we see a lot of Japanese workers end up in Hawaii working on the plantations. Now, with the Hawaii part, this is a great example of where labor is needed and something has happened to create that demand. So work with me through this, and we'll kind of attach this to the feminism or the famine motivation or the overpopulation motivation. So in Hawaii, if you remember from one of the previous lectures, in Hawaii, the native population was exposed to Western diseases, leading to a significant decline in the native population. Now, American businesses that had plantations, sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, banana plantations, those American businesses required laborers. The native Hawaiian population had declined significantly. So the Japanese immigration is going to provide that labor. So that's one example of the type of things that were going on. And then, of course, there's political disruption. That would be an example of the Taiping Rebellion. Political upheaval sometimes forced immigrants or forced people to leave their country in search of new opportunities overseas. And the Taiping Rebellion is one such example. So when we look at this, the other thing, if we go back to industrialism for one moment, we can also throw in mining. Mining operations are starting to pick up in terms of in Africa and South America, and mining operations require miners. So the idea is that the biggest motivation for migration was that there were people looking for jobs. They had more job opportunities because of the changes in technology and because of the economic changes of the 19th century. There were new jobs, whether they be in factories, they be on plantations, or they be in the mines. These new types of jobs were looking for people from across the globe. And India, China, Japan, you can find several other examples, Europe, all throughout Europe. There are going to be many from the lower classes that seek these jobs out, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes in the form of indentured servitude or in contract labor. So, for our last thing, we want to look at the impact of the movement of these people. And this is something that I think you guys understand very easily. And all you have to do is really recognize the patterns in any given example. So, the impact on the home society, what happens when you have a number of Indians leaving India? How does that change India? And that's the type of thing that we want to focus on. Generally speaking, there are more men leaving than women. So, in terms of migrant workers, when we talk about immigrant labor, most of that immigrant labor is male. That means that women who are left at home tend to become more autonomous. They sometimes we have a shift in gender roles. Sorry, I have the hiccups. We have a shift in gender roles where women have to assume responsibilities that they typically did not have to assume before. But other times, sometimes a man would not leave until a male member of his family came to stay with his family. So let's say a man wanted to leave and his brother was able to stay with his family while the man left. Then you wouldn't necessarily have those gender changes. So everything is circumstantial. It depends on where you are. But the biggest thing that I think is of importance is that, especially for the voluntary labor, these men who go overseas to work, usually it's meant to be temporary. So they go, they work for a period of time, and then they come back home. And during that period of time, they're sending remittance. What they're doing is they're taking their wages and they're sending it back to their family. So think for one moment about the Indian laborer who goes abroad to work. He's probably working for a short period of time, 1, 2, maybe 3 years. And during that period of time, he's sending the money back to his family. Now, for his family, this extra income is going to improve their social economic status. The family, maybe the woman doesn't have to put in so many hours in a job because she can live off of the wages that are coming in. And maybe she can afford to send her children to school for a longer period of time. And that is that is the type of thing that happened during this period of time. It also, for women, if we come back to the role of women, if the men are sending the money back to the women are the ones who get to decide how it's going to be spent. So now women have a greater financial role in their family than they would before the migration. Now, again, is this absolutely true for every region? Not necessarily. But those are some of the examples of the impact on the home society. The impact on the receiving society, I think you guys are going to be much more familiar with given your historical background. One, when you do have this migration of people, what those people tend to do, whether they be Indians or they be Chinese or Japanese or Italians, they tend to find each other in the new country and they tend to form what we call ethnic enclaves. Or, in other words, they start living near each other. And these ethnic enclaves, if you guys remember from earlier in the year, we talked about this idea of diasporic communities. And in this way, they're very similar to a diasporic community. These ethnic enclaves are going to introduce new foods, new traditions. They're going to introduce new languages to the receiving societies. So if you've ever heard the expression or the place of Chinatown, Chinatown would be an example of an ethnic enclave and it becomes incorporated into the greater receiving society. And that leads me to number two, this concept of cultural diffusion. The idea that holidays, customs, dress, food, music, all of these things are going to come into the receiving society. Our celebration of St. Patrick's Day is obviously influenced by the Irish immigration. Um, we can go through and do multiple examples. The important thing is that you recognize those examples. Receiving societies also sought to regulate immigration. So the one you know from US history is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But that wasn't just happening in the United States. There is also a movement in Australia to restrict immigrants who are coming into Australia, Chinese immigrants in particular, who by some Australians were deemed as destroying the European society. So the regulation of immigration was very common in the 19th century. And then, of course, you have discrimination against immigrants. And this, again, I think is something you guys grasp from your study of US history. And the example I'll use comes from US history, the discrimination towards the Irish during the 1850s. The idea that there were signs that said, help wanted, Irish need not apply. and the discrimination towards the Irish immigrant community. We also see that discrimination against the Chinese community within within Australia, where sometimes oh white Australian miners attack Chinese groups with very little repercussions against them. In the case of South Africa, Indian immigrants were discriminated against and they were forced to ride in separate trains and separate cars. One Indian in particular who was in South Africa was forced to ride a different train car than the white South Africans, and that's where he began to say, "Wait a minute, this is wrong." And that man was Gandhi. So if you use Gandhi as an example of understanding this global connection, here's an Indian in South Africa, and he experiences discrimination in the form of separate services on the train. Then you have a good example of a broader thing that was going on at the time. So again, with this, I think a lot of this you can connect not just to present day, but also throughout your study of American history. And you can see a lot of similarities between what I'm talking about. Um, with any questions, please bring them to class. And this is the last topic of Unit 6. And so for the next unit, we'll be going into the 20th and 21st century. And the next thing we'll talk about is World War I. So in the meantime, stay safe and we will talk soon.